Hey folks, so today is the fifth in my LSAT Insight series, and today's a special one. This is what I would consider the key insight for what it took for me to get a 180. Specifically, it's how I know when a bad answer is the right answer. So some of you who have been following me, this may be somewhat familiar from RC, but we're going to get a little bit deeper into the specifics of the mindset and what it takes and what I'm actually doing. So it's not clickbait. This is the real deal. I believe what I'm covering today is the secret sauce to my 180 on the September '09 exam. So a little bit about my experience. LR was the final frontier for me. So while I didn't hate doing LR quite as much as I hated doing RC, my problem was that I was still averaging about -3 per section. And so this was back in the day when there were 4 graded sections, 2 of them being LR, so that averaged to about -6 per exam that I was doing. What I'm going to cover today with you guys is how I got this -6 down to a -2, -0 for an entire prep test. So in terms of what this lesson actually contains, the insights here were originally going to be an extension of LR Lesson 5. I was going to do like an LR Lesson 5.5. But someone emailed me a great question, and I decided it made more sense to present it this way. So for me personally, the key insight for pushing LR and RC to an extent to -0 is understanding that an answer might be logically incorrect, but it might nonetheless be somehow still correct for the exam. The net effect is that this allows me to maintain a consistently high logical standard when calling answers incorrect, and that's useful for most of the section. But this also allows me to reconsider any eliminations I may have made in error, if none of the answers seem correct. And that's the secret to my general immunity to all the worst LSAT tricks out there. And I can already hear the pushback from students and fellow tutors on this. But what it comes down to is that I have found it counterproductive to try to persuade people to like or accept what is an objectively inferior answer on its own terms. And I will die on this hill. To this day, there are a number of quote-unquote correct answers that I believe are objectively awful. I call them correct in quotes simply because the other choices are even more inferior. So as promised, I'm going to get into a little bit more sort of theoretical detail than I would in a discussion that we had in the context of LR specifically or RC specifically, because I have addressed this before, but not quite in such detail. So what do we mean by, quote, logically incorrect? I put logically in quotes here because it is not actually logical rules that I'm talking about when I'm saying correct and incorrect. If an answer choice commits an actual logical error, such as pretending like the stimulus makes a part-to-whole error or a necessity sufficiency error, when that didn't actually happen, then that answer is not salvageable. It's just wrong. So what I mean by logically incorrect is, as some of you may have been guessing already, actually the term stretch. And those of you, again, who have been following my content will have heard me say this word stretch quite a few times. So to define what a stretch is, I consider officially a stretch to be when there is a word or concept in the answer choice that we, without any really solid, foolproof basis in either the stimulus or the answer choice itself, must interpret that stretchy thing in a specific way, in a usually highly convenient way, in order to make the answer correct. In the 160 score range, making such interpretations is usually disastrous. And I would say it's actually the reason why a lot of folks can't get out of the 160s, is because you've seen some of the harder questions. And those hardest questions, the ones that you need to get right in order to break 170, those questions require you to deal with stretches a little bit more flexibly. But if you tend to just apply that because you've seen, oh, the hardest questions actually do this, and you get scared of having logical strictness, and you apply that same stretch flexibility to medium or easy questions, you're going to get the medium or easy questions wrong. Because on those questions, you actually do need to be pretty strict. There's no stretching. You got to be strict on those. But to nail those hardest questions, it seems that the high standard of if it's a stretch, eliminate it, that works, like I just said, for medium or easy questions. That's no longer foolproof. That doesn't work for the questions that you need to get right, those hardest ones. It doesn't work for those that you need to get right to break 170. So really all of that is just a fancy way of saying sometimes an objectively bad answer is the correct one according to the exam. And separating those two ideas is quite difficult. It may look fairly simple and easy to internalize just because I've kind of laid it out here. But when it gets down to brass tacks, when it gets down to actually doing it, it's a lot harder to actually pull this off in your head than it may appear here. So what is it that I actually do? Much like LG, where I avoid all but the most obvious deductions up front, on LR and RC, I avoid all but the most obvious pre-phrases. Instead of doing that, I lean heavily on the general form of the assumption, which I've discussed before, and the negative space that doing so highlights. And negative space, of course, is something that I've also discussed in other lessons. But just in case some of you are not aware, what I consider the general form of the assumption is as follows. Premise P alone is enough to prove conclusion C. As for negative space, I begin asking, based on what the general form of the assumption just told us, does P, without any help, actually prove C? Might we need something else to complete the picture? This approach, while being notably useless for doing precise pre-phrasing, allows me the flexibility to be properly critical of all the wrong answers, yet still leave me the opportunity, thanks to my negative space thinking, to give the also wrong yet actually correct answer a second chance. So to kind of demonstrate what I would consider a pretty good snapshot of how I deal with this situation, I'm going to be looking at PT 77, Section 4, Question 26. And one of your fellow viewers recently asked me about this question, and I thought it would be a good place to model the flexibility that I've just been talking about. So as I've generally been doing on the channel, I'm going to start with the breakdown, and within the breakdown, I always start with the premises. So we'll start with the very first premise that I see here. To help with stability issues, ships empty ballast tanks when they're loaded, and they fill ballast tanks when they are unloaded. We then get a second premise. Sea creatures often get pumped into these ballast tanks at their home location X, and then they get dumped out somewhere else at Y when the ship empties out its ballast tank. And so these creatures that get taken from their home location X and dropped at some other location Y, these creatures often wreak ecological havoc at Y. That's what our statement tells us. And we actually finally get a fourth premise. This one was attached to the second half of the conclusion. Well, actually not the second half of the conclusion. We get the conclusion, a comma, and then we get this premise. Mid-ocean creatures and coastal creatures can't actually survive in each other's habitats. So just a note here, how did I know to add this as a premise? The word since in that final sentence there shows that the things that follow the word since are being offered as a justification for what came before, and that's what premises do. Premises serve as justifications, reasons to believe a conclusion. Speaking of which, our conclusion, this tells us that filling and emptying ballast tanks in the middle of the ocean will solve the havoc problem. It seems to be a recommendation. And so based on this breakdown, I tried to formulate an assumption, and this is what happened. My usual sort of red, blue, purple approach initially seemed difficult here because we got a lot of information in the premises. Each premise itself is arguably an entirely independent red concept on its own. And if I look at the conclusion, almost the entire conclusion could be highlighted as the blue concept. And so basically it would be the same effect as like when you're over highlighting in a college class or something like that. You have a book or a reading or something, and you just end up coloring the whole page. There's that highlighting thing just doesn't really help you that much. To make matters worse, there is a potential disconnect between premise 3 and premise 4. We move from talking about unable to wreak ecological havoc at Y to can't survive at Y. And just to kind of harken back to a different conversation we've had previously in other LR lessons, usually on the easier questions, the disconnect in an argument is between the red concept in the premises and a blue identifiable concept in the conclusion. That's kind of the way the standard easy question does it. They can complicate things by not really putting the red and blue disconnect across the premises and the conclusion, but instead they actually put that disconnect inside the premises themselves. And I feel like there's a mixture of those techniques going on here, and I'm kind of worried, frankly. None of this is looking good. So because my usual red, blue, purple thing, I saw ways that I could kind of force it, but I didn't really imagine that it would be that helpful. I just moved to making the general form of the assumption, because I was at a loss for what else to do. And suddenly, when I tried that, I saw that maybe I could use the red, blue, purple setup with some simplification. So if the general form of the assumption in this case is that the arguer assumes the recommendation in the conclusion will actually solve the problems that were presented in the premises, I could kind of highlight it like so. The recommendation is the blue thing, the kind of new thing that appears in the conclusion. And I just collapse all the premises into a general statement of problems presented in the premises, slap red on that, and all of a sudden I do have a little bit of a red, blue, purple thing going on. Again, this isn't perfect though. As usual, the general form of the assumption that I have here is absolutely useless for pre-phrasing a specific prediction. However, it does help me with negative space thinking. So what did I come up with in terms of negative space? The first question that came to mind in sort of my negative space mode was, will the mid-ocean fill/empty actually solve the problems? And so the first issue that I came across was that, because this was the first premise, maybe there are some issues regarding ship stability and this recommendation. The first thing I thought of in this regard was, if ships just empty and fill their ballast tanks in the middle of the ocean, are they somehow unloading and loading in the middle of the ocean? If they're not loading and unloading out there and they're just pointlessly emptying and filling, I mean, what's the point of that? How does that affect stability? What does that do for anybody? And so ultimately, I did dismiss this thought because the conclusion really only cared about solving the ecological havoc issue. I mean, at least that's how I saw it. And therefore, it seemed unconcerned with the fate of the ships. So I was like, yeah, sure, I thought of ship stability as a potential issue, but looking at the conclusion, because I thought it was really about the environmental havoc, I didn't really think much of it. I thought maybe I'm just barking up the wrong tree, and I did quite strongly dismiss this in my mind. So then I shifted to thinking about ecological havoc. And so in terms of ecological havoc, I kind of went back to the red, blue, purple issue that I spotted, one of them at least, which was that premise 3 and premise 4 didn't really line up. Does the not being able to survive at Y, which was from premise 4, also prove that something is not able to wreak ecological havoc at location Y, which was sort of the main issue brought up in premise 3? So at first blush, this one does sound better to me than the ship stability idea that I just dismissed in the last slide. But then again, if I look at the recommendation and the conclusion, that recommendation is just to both fill and empty out there in the middle of the ocean. That wouldn't even really move a mid-ocean creature to the coast or vice versa, pretty much invalidating this survival versus havoc disconnect that I was investigating. So this one also seemed like something of a bust at this point. So full stop, complete, full disclosure, 100% seriously, at this point when I was doing this question, I literally thought, I'm kind of effed here, I'm screwed. I'm just going to hope that I can eliminate some answers. That's literally what I thought. And so I did come up with two ideas about what I thought was wrong here, so that ship stability issue and the survival versus havoc issue. But as I just got through explaining, I did see reasons to not like either of them. And these reasons weren't just general discomfort. On an easier question, these would have been very good reasons, I think, to dismiss a particular idea. But yeah, the whole point is that I saw reasons not to like either of them. And so really, even though I was going to push forward into the answers, I really also didn't know what to expect out of the answers. I was going in blind and unprepared. So in terms of answer choices, just start right up with A first in the list, and mercifully I did find a reason to eliminate this. All we know from the stimulus is that mid-ocean creatures are incompatible with coastal areas, and coastal creatures are incompatible with mid-ocean areas in terms of survival. That's all that the recommendation is based on, this inability to survive in each other's environment. But choice A here suggests that we need to make sure no potentially harmful creatures get into the tanks, and that's not something our arguer really needs or is concerned about. This whole thing was about creatures that can't survive in one place or another, not that we need to just totally remove any possibility of it whatsoever with this recommendation. That's not really what they're going after. At least that's not how I saw it. So moving on to B, I also found a reason to eliminate this one. So B didn't sound like entirely incorrect at first glance, but reading the whole way through, I did not like that this added extra elements about what ships need in order to pull off ballast dumps and fills out in the middle of the ocean. I feel like B would have been much better if they had left it more general, like something like it is actually possible to pull off this procedure mid-ocean. But here I believe they went too far by adding all those calm winds calm winds and calm seas situation. Just too much. We didn't need that information. That adds nothing to our discussion. But interestingly, this answer does tap into the ship-based assumption that I dismissed earlier, and so I was beginning to suspect/fear that I may need to be forced to revisit that assumptive issue later. Moving on to C, though, I also did find a reason to eliminate this one. And I have to say, this one was very tempting. It sounds almost exactly like my creature-based assumption, the one which questioned the link between not able to survive and not able to wreak havoc. However, C goes too far by adding an extra condition, much like B did, of being dumped there by a ship. In the end, nobody really cares about how the creatures get there. The premises and the conclusion and that recommendation, for those things, the important thing is whether or not they can cause havoc, even if they can't survive. So how they get there doesn't matter. Is it possible for them to do the damage that they supposedly could or could not do once they get there? So pushing on to D, I also found reasons to eliminate this one. To me, this sounded like just a useless repeat of a premise. You might be tempted into thinking that D here plugs into the ship-based assumption, the stability one. But I didn't think the recommendation cared if the mid-ocean dump/refill lines up with loading or unloading at all. Again, my perspective was that it was about the havoc problem, not really the ship stability problem. Because if it was, it did a terrible job of actually addressing it. And so by the time I got to E, I was actually a little bit scared. I had found pretty clear reasons in my mind to get rid of A through E, and I wasn't sure if, or excuse me, A through D, I wasn't sure if E would be any different. I felt like there was a good chance that I would eliminate this one and I would have to go through all five again. But, as it turns out, when I did an analysis on this one, as much as I disliked it, I felt that this was still selectable compared to the others. And so E happens to be pretty much exactly in line with my ship/stability based assumption. The one that I thought was not important because the conclusion didn't really seem to care about ships and really seemed to be only concerned with stopping the havoc. And as I was saying earlier, honestly, I still think this is a bad answer and irrelevant because I do remain convinced that as written, the only problem the conclusion is trying to solve is the havoc problem, not the ship stability problem. So that would really make this, in my mind, quite irrelevant to the recommendation. The issue, though, is that all of the others are wrong for quite specific reasons, and I at least detected this issue that E is talking about during my analysis, so I did end up selecting it. But just to give you a comparison, we will go through kind of a lightning breakdown of a comparison of all the rest to E. So those promised comparisons. So A is worse than E, because A overextends on the survival versus havoc issue by adding a no potentially havoc-y creatures condition that our arguer really isn't concerned about and doesn't really impact our argument. E was also better than B, because B overextends on the ship stability issue, because it adds the calm seas and winds nonsense that, again, doesn't really matter to our argument. We don't really need to know the conditions that ships require for being able to pull this off. We are really more interested in figuring out if following the recommendation actually impacts stability in some way. Again, B starts fine, but then pushes too far. It overextends. E is also better than C, and you're going to start seeing that there's some familiar vocab here. C also overextends, but it's overextending like A does on the survival versus havoc issue by adding the condition of being dumped at Y by a ship. And again, it really didn't seem to matter how the creatures got to the foreign location. It was what those creatures were able to do at that location that seemed to matter. E is also better than D. In D, the problem isn't that there's an overextension. There is no overextension there, but it's basically a repeat of a premise and doesn't even directly invoke the ship stability issue to even sound like an assumption. So it's not really occupying any sort of assumptive space. So it really isn't what we're looking for. And so kind of going back full circle to E now, compared to the others, E has no overextension like A through C did. It's pretty much a plain vanilla statement of my ship stability issue that I identified during my negative space analysis. And unlike D, it's not just a rehash of a premise, but it actually addresses something in the assumptive negative space that I was thinking about. So at this point, I want to make sure that you guys have noticed what I did not have to do on this question. The first thing is I did not have to make a precise prephrase. Sure, choice E ultimately reflected my ship stability concerns, but I definitely did not prephrase E at all at any point in my analysis, specifically. There was also none of the negation tactic that you might use on some necessary assumption questions. I actually forgot this was a necessary assumption question by the time I got to the answer choice. I was so scared and so lost by the messiness of the premises and my inability to come up with a solid prediction that seemed to remain relevant. I had reasons to dismiss both the ship stability issue and the survival versus havoc issue. I found both of those to be kind of discounted by the way the conclusion was written. So I was really lost. I was much more concerned about that. I'd actually, like I said, forgotten that this was a necessary assumption question to begin with. So I didn't use any special treatment for necessary assumption questions here. And perhaps most importantly, I have never, not during the process of doing this question, and even now, accepted E as being logically correct. I really do think E is an objectively terrible response. To this day, I remain convinced that the conclusion really only cares about solving the ecological havoc issue. I don't think there's a different way to read it. And it's not having a broader discussion about the practical realities of the recommendation. It doesn't really seem to matter to the arguer, and therefore really shouldn't matter to us in that sense, whether or not this is even possible. This is just saying that if the problem looks this way, doing this response would address the issue. And if we're looking at just the logic of how they put that together, I would say that most of the exam allows you, in fact, enforces a certain view where you are not thinking about all the underlying practical realities. Now, because really, if you could do that for any argument, there's almost no point in having logical restrictions at all. Anybody could make any argument, even a pretty good sounding one, and you could just bring in some outside information, be like, oh well, it's just not possible. I just don't think it's possible. And then if that's how you do logic, then it's that doesn't sound like what we do on LR anywhere else. It really doesn't. Unfortunately, necessary assumption questions do have a nasty habit of breaking that wall, that restriction, and pretending like we all of a sudden do need to care about the broader practical realities of a situation, instead of just remaining focused on the logic at play. And so that, I think, is why a lot of people find this particular class of questions a little bit more difficult. But all the same, I hopefully have just shown you that you don't need to treat necessary assumption questions and difficult LR any differently than you would just kind of do any standard question. It just comes down to the answer choices and finding different ways to accept answers that are objectively incorrect. And so just to kind of wrap things up, I do want to add this set of remarks. Talk to me, guys. I would like to remind you, I mentioned this in passing at the very beginning, but this video was almost entirely inspired by a viewer like you who emailed me about an entirely different issue. They emailed me about this question, but they were asking it different. They were asking not for the secret sauce, but they were just asking me for generalization help on this question. So that person who emailed me wanted me to elaborate on generalization and pre-phrasing for difficult and dense stimuli, like question 77, section 4, number 26. And I emailed them back the explanation that you more or less see here in its full form. And as I was doing that and composing it, I noticed that it was a pretty good condensation of the secret sauce discussion that I originally intended to take a different form. Like I said at the beginning, I was considering throwing this into my LR lesson series. But as I was kind of talking it out, I realized that the principles there were a little bit more universal. They were applicable to difficult RC as well. And in general, I thought the idea of an answer being logically incorrect but correct for the exam was important enough to merit a entirely independent discussion here. So the moral of the story is that your feedback and questions help me, but they also help your fellow students. So don't be shy, reach out to me if you have a question. Who knows what good stuff will come of it. At the very least, you'll get your question answered, and perhaps, if we're lucky, we'll get some greater insight here as well. And that is all for this one, folks. As usual, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. That helps the channel, and helping the channel makes it grow, makes it reach more people, and overall is kind of going to help me with my teaching objectives. And again, I would like to reiterate my invitation to contact me. At the very least, you'll get a question answered, and maybe you'll even get kind of a video to grow out of it. So who knows, right? So reach out to me. Don't be shy.